Last month, President Cyril Ramaphosa announced a significant package of social and economic measures to address the fallout from the country's COVID-19 lockdown. Now, to talk to us about the impact of COVID-19 on the poor, we're joined via Skype by Isobel Frye, who is the Director of the Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute. A very good afternoon to you, Isobel, and thank you so very much for joining us here on SABC News.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation.
Well, I mean, it's so clear now just how big that economic gap is between the rich and the poor in our country. Talk to us about how COVID-19 has really highlighted that and perhaps made things even worse.
Yes, indeed. We know that South Africa is the most unequal country in the world. We also know that poverty levels pre the COVID-19 epidemic were unsustainable. 1 in 4 people was living below the food poverty line. 1 in 2 people was living under the upper bound poverty line. And that's exacerbated. We see that on a daily basis. We see the incredibly long queues of people queuing just for food, just for the ability to sustain themselves. And unfortunately, we've seen an apparent radio silence from the minister. We saw the initial announcement on the 21st of April by the president announcing that people would be able to receive far greater social security grants than there had been. Many of us saw that as being some kind of agreement that we needed to have an economic stimulus from below. But in addition to that, that government was listening to people's needs and trying to ensure that they would not be further pushed into poverty. What we've seen from the Department of Social Development, as your last insert was showing, is just a huge amount of chaos. Firstly, there was a confusion about whether the child support grant top-up would go to every child. We then discovered that it was to the child support grant beneficiary, which legally is the caregiver. So instead of one caregiver of 3 children getting 3 top-ups, she or he would be eligible for 1. So that firstly was a huge chaos and led to a real concern amongst many people because there was no clarity coming from the minister. Secondly, we saw recently the payment of the child support grant and other grants fiasco. What we'd seen was that the department was saying that grants were going to be delayed. So generally, the grant lasts for 2 weeks in every month. And instead, beneficiaries were having to eke out a further 5 days. And then some of the SASSA payments ran out of money. And we also had the double payment of many beneficiaries. Now, it's still not clear whether or not those beneficiaries are going to be entitled to hold on to that money or would have to pay it back. And we know that when that's the only income into households, to pay it back is going to be irrevocable damage. So in addition to that, the minister, as I've said, has been very, very absent. Now, as social development, you would imagine that minister would be the caring face of the nation. I'm not sure whether that's a role reserved for Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, but we have not seen her coming forward. She's also been too busy to speak to the social partners in NEDLAC since the beginning of lockdown. And none of this really gives people who are living in starvation any real hope. We saw beneficiaries talking about the awful state of some of the food parcels, and yet social relief of distress food vouchers are not coming through. BASA, the Banking Association of South Africa, says that they are hamstrung because they receive all the information files from SASSA. Yeah. So at the beginning of the lockdown, having heard the president's announcement, I was very positive and said that really the ruling party was embracing the social democracy. Right now, it seems that the poor are really getting forgotten.
Yeah, you know, one of the biggest issues we've also noted as we grapple now with COVID-19 is that, we've seen long queues that have been snaking at various social grant pay points and even at some of these stores. We've seen that, in some of these areas, there's only maybe one shop that you can go to or one shopping center that one can go to. And then, of course, that means that we're ignoring social distancing regulations. I mean, what could this ultimately mean then for those that are the most vulnerable in our society?
Once again, I think you've highlighted a really good point. Before lockdown, many people in the informal economy came through as informal traders, and thus were able to not only provide a living for themselves and their families, but also to create some kind of competition from the single shop scenario that you identified. Now what we're seeing is largely malls, large supermarkets coming in. We have been quite disappointed in not seeing retailers dropping their prices. But instead, we see that whereas in suburbs and urban areas, social distancing is really enforced, when it comes to people who are most vulnerable, it seems that these things are being disregarded. So we see people who are desperate for food, and we don't see any kind of relief that enables them to receive it in a dignified manner that also looks after their own well-being. We need informal traders back on the street. With the informal traders associations are very engaged with the kind of PPEs that their members need to receive, and yet we again have mixed messages from the state around the permits that are available to informal traders.
Yeah, all right. And then just in closing, I mean, how can the system really be improved? The one that of, sending out food parcels. There have been so many problems that have been highlighted with that. What is the main issue, and how can it really be addressed? I mean, it's such a difficult situation because I think also the fact that the government, hasn't found itself in this sort of situation where we're in the midst of a global pandemic. What could they do better? And I know you earlier touched on some of the things that government can do, but in terms of the food parcels, which has been quite the issue, what exactly must be done?
The Department of Social Development has been inundated by offers from community constituency at NEDLAC and other organizations of respected and credited NGOs and NPOs. Who've offered to partner with government in terms of not only distributing food parcels, but also ensuring that community workers are able to go into households, are able to ascertain the levels of hunger and starvation, the healthcare needs, the medication, especially for people who are on ARVs, and then finally the eligibility for social grants and levels of gender-based violence that might exist. Now, these are our foot soldiers who are willing and available to volunteer their time. And we've received very little encouragement or partnership offers from the state. We heard earlier that local councillors, and in some cases, are being accused of corruption in terms of distribution of food parcels. We think that the non-profit sector really should be embraced as an adjunct to the state to enable them to have eyes and ears in households, in communities, on the streets. And so we would encourage the Minister of Social Development to use this. And social partners are also encouraging faith-based organizations to come together to form an umbrella of what in the old days we saw as the United Democratic Front. And we fail to understand why this offer of help is just being ignored.
Yeah. Isobel Frye, thank you so very much for chatting to us and joining us here on SABC News. We really do appreciate it. Thank you.